It's the third. It's the third mimer in the Dvar Malchus. This week is a heavy-duty week, so we have three mimarim in the Dvar Malchus. We're going to be learning. The first two are on Shavuos. We're going to be learning first the mimer on the parsha of the week, which is Nasa. Shiata Deshmaya, Shabbos Parshas Nasa, Yud Beis Sivan Tavshin Chavei. Nasa is right in Gershon Gam Heim V'Goyim and Daikra Bein Nozakim L'Chutei Torah. Alter Rebbe asks on this pasuk what it says. Count the heads of the Bnei Gershon, family of Gershon, also them. So the Alter Rebbe asks in L'Chutei Torah, what is this also? Yesh Lahavin Lama Bnei Gershon Gam Heim. Why does it say by the family of Gershon? It says also them. The point of explanation this is the idea of counting the head, but it doesn't use other words for counting, but it uses the word nasoi, which is related to uplifting and raising up. Therefore, he says, the idea behind this is to elevate the level of the head. That's to raise up the head, literally, not just the concept of counting. And where we're raising up the level of a head is identified with intellect, with chachma. And what is the level that's on top of the head? What's the level that transcends the head? We're raising it up to the level of will, which will is higher than intellect. The keser, it's the level of keser. So when we say nasu yesroish, we're raising the head, we're raising the intellect to the level of the crown. The main, this main elevation is through being involved in Torah. That is the supernal will, that is the will of above. In other words, how do we take our head, our intellect, and raise it up to the level of will? So when we use our intellect to study Torah, since Torah is Hashem's divine will, so therefore we're taking our head, we're taking our intellect and raising it up to the level of the will, to the level of Keser. Now, in truth, one may think that the level of will is also to be found by mitzvahs. So what is unique about the study of Torah? The Rebbe goes on line 8, more specifically, there's an advantage in Torah also over performance of mitzvahs. Though mitzvahs are also Ratzon Elyon, it's also Hashem's will. The mitzvahs are there also the will of above. They are only a state that they surround us and encompass us. When we perform a mitzvah, the Alter Rebbe says right away in the beginning of Tanya, in Perek Daled, that this is all makif. Perek Daled, Perek Hey. It's something outside of us. It surrounds us. You put on a talus, it's outside of us. In this sukkah, it's outside of us. You put on tefillin, mezuzah. All of these things are not something that permeate us, but there's something outside of us. Therefore, spiritually as well, this indicates that the revelation does not shine in an internal light, in actuality. But the Torah is an actual internal type of light, a permeating light. The Sharsha Gamki Keser, and its root is also from the inner level of Keser. So in other words, in Keser itself, there is the level that has more to do with a transcendent level, and that's the level that has to do with mitzvahs. And as opposed to that, the level that has to do with Torah, just like Torah is something that's internalized within us and comes within us in an internal fashion, so too the level of Keser that is coming down is an internal level of Keser, not the transcendent and external level of Keser. Therefore, when it comes to the family of Kahas, that they would carry the Aron. And what was contained in the Aron? The Aron was the Luchas. The Luchas indicate the level of Torah. Nemar Nosoi Esroish. They said, carry the head, raise the head. because with Torah, we raised up the level of intellect, we raised up the level of the Bnei Kos, all the way to the level of Kes. Gam Bnei Gershon, also the family of Gershon, the children of Gershon, since their job was to carry the coverings that were on the top of the Mishkan, on the side of the Mishkan, Bechinas HaMakif, that indicates a level that was transcendent, not like the Torah, which is internalized, but rather like the Makifim of the Mishkan, Dugmas HaMshachah Shaydei HaMitzvahs. So the Bnei Gershon are similar to that which is drawn down through mitzvahs, which is a makif level. Therefore, it says, but them also the term raise the head, because by them also there's the level of raising up and going up to the level of Keser. That's the level of the ascent of Keser. So therefore, both the Bnei Kos that carry the luchis, the Torah, and the Bnei Gershon that carry the ariyos, the curtains, the coverings of the Mishkan, which is the makif, both of them were raised up to Kesef. And their point was about elevating the Kesef. Kol Makom still Mol Nemar, it says Bnei Gershon Gam Heim, also the Bnei Gershon. Why does it say the word also? Gam, like we asked at the beginning of the Mimer. The word Gam indicates that there is something that's primary, and then there's something that's additional to that. Because by the Bnei Gershon, it's still in the way of Makif, it's still a level that's transcendent. It's not the ultimate level that permeates the Ilu Ikering and Nisiyas Rosh, as opposed to the primary idea of raising the head. Namra of Bnei Kos was said by the family of Kos, that they carried the luchais, that shines in an internalized fashion, and therefore they are core, they are the main thing. And then another point that Rebbe brings out over here, the oidzos, in addition to this, the Bnei Gershon, that they elevate the midos. They are about the raising up of the emotions, the attributes, the character traits. They raise it up to what level? To the level that it relates to in Kesser. So in Kesser, there's the level of Arech Ampin. Again, the external level of Kesser. The external level of Kesser, Arech Ampin, relates to the midas below. That's the level of B'chinas midas shalamayla maseichel. They raise up the attributes, the emotions of Atzilus, for example, the emotions and character traits of Seder Ishtalshlus to the level of the midas that are higher than Seder Ishtalshlus, the midas that are higher than intellect. Otherwise known in Kabbalah terminology, B'chinas Zayin Tachtoin is the Arich Ampin, the seven lower the seven lower levels of Arich Ampin, meaning the seven midas of Arich Ampin. Ava B'nei Kos, top of page Memvav, as opposed to the family of Kos, Mailas B'chinas HaChochma, they elevate and raise up the level of Chochma, the B'chinas HaChochma should be Keser, to the level of Chochma that is in Keser. So up till now, we showed another distinction between B'nei Kos and B'nei Gershon. Why B'nei Gershon is only Gam, also, that they are second to the B'nai Kos, because the B'nai Kos, first of all, has it an Ur Pnimi, and secondly, now we bring down the B'nai Kos, since they're elevating the level of intellect, which is Torah, so therefore they are elevating it to Pnimius HaKeser, as opposed to B'nai Gershon, that they are elevating the Midas, they are only elevating it to the Midas that are beyond Seichel, that's the seven lower levels of Arich, it's not the inner level of Keser, it's not the Chochmah Sheba Keser, and so on. Now he's going to introduce the third family. Avol, avoidus b'nei Merari, but the avoida of the family of Merari, the children of Merari, it is the awe that is derived and is a result from the head and the brain. Therefore, when it comes to b'nei Merari, it doesn't even use the term nasoi es roish. Why? because it's not about the head. It has nothing to do with the head. It has to do with the level that is lower than the head. It's not about elevating it to something that's higher than the head or elevating the head and so on. It's about the awe that comes down and is lower than the level of intellect. Moise of Leviathan, the Alter Rebbe continues to explain over there in that Maimer and the Torah, on Parshas Nasai, that idea of raising the head indicates the avodah in a way of traveling without a boundary, without limitations. It's the idea of the service in a way of with all your might, meaning without any limitations, as we always know. Chassidus speaks about ma'od means b'ligvul, without any boundaries. Like it says in the pasuk, I will place you and I will make you a traveler amongst these standing ones. The pirish mahalchim, which naming a hiluch. The idea of the explanation of traveling is two types of travel. One type of traveling is when a person has the level of an inspiration down here below that's known as Ru'usa Daliba. It's the will of the heart. So then that is one type of traveling that we're saying that neshamas have over malachim, that we call them travelers in regards and comparison to those that are standing still. This traveling of the will of the heart, that is the Bnei Gershon. And since it's something coming from my heart, similar to the idea of tefillah, that tefillah is also explained that tefillah is coming from below to above. It's from me going upwards. And the second type of traveling is through Torah mitzvahs. It's a traveling and it's a drawing down from above to below. We're taking the Torah as a revelation from above, coming down here below. Hashem's will coming down through Torah. Hashem's will coming down through mitzvahs. So we are traveling and drawing down from this high level down here below, as opposed to Rus Daliba, which is going from below to above. And this is through the Bnei Kos, that they are the ones that are carrying the luchos. The luchos encapsulate the Torah. And over here, he's speaking about Torah in a more general form that includes the Torah and the mitzvahs. Therefore, by both of them, it says the idea of raising the head. In other words, because we're elevating this level to beyond Seder Ishtalshus, like we said before. And the level of traveling has to be amongst the standards. What does standing also indicate? Usually when we talk about that I will make you a traveler amongst the standards, that is, we're talking usually about the neshamas are called traveling, malachim are called standing still. Sometimes we also contrast it between the neshamas down here versus the neshamas above, that even the neshamas above are considered standing still, the neshamas down here below are considered travelers. Here we introduce a different idea of standing. Where do we find in the Torah the idea of standing? We find it, we're talking about those that were carrying the Mishkan. They carried the luchas, they carried the aron, they carried the ariyas, etc., etc. In other words, there is the idea of the standing parts of the Mishkan. What's the standing parts of the Mishkan? Bechinas, line 14, Bechinas atze shitim oimdim. The Bnei Merari. This is the standing cedar wood that was carried, and that was the avodah of the Bnei Merari. Shavidosam, hoisam, masa akroshim. The avodah of the family of Merari. What did they carry? They carried the boards, the beams that made up the walls of the Mishkan. That the crushing, these walls, these beams were made up from the standing cedar wood. So instead of it being the avodah that we spoke about before, of the chol me'oidecham, that when a person is in the level of mahalchim, traveling, we've had this recently as well, many times, the idea of mahalchim means that they're able to break out of their boundaries. If a person is limited where and how far they can go, so they're not really considered a traveler. A traveler is one that's able to go without any types of limitations whatsoever. But the Atzel Shittim Oimdim, the Bnei Merari, we're saying then they do not serve in the level of B'chol Meidecha. They do not serve in the level of Bligvul. It's not a level of Mahalchim. It's not in a way of traveling, but rather it's a way of Atzel Shittim Oimdim. Inyan ha'avoida the b'chol nafshecha shebchinas amida. That's the avoida with all your soul. That's the level of standing. In other words, instead of it being a level of b'chol meidecha, it's only b'chol nafshecha. On the other hand, amida, the idea of standing, indicates a very high level of bit. It's nothing to sneeze at. We know Shemoneh Esrei is also called amida. Amida shows that they're standing in a way of bittul before the Eibishter. So this idea of standing in a way of bittul shows on a level of the service of B'chol Nafshecham. But l'chein lo namer b'hem Mesias Roish, therefore it doesn't say by them the level of raising up the head, because raising up the head indicates that level of Mahalchim, that level of going beyond. Whereas Atzi Shittim Oimdim indicates the idea of standing still. They are in that place where they are. This is essentially what the Rebbe is doing over here, is summing up the mimer of this week's Likutei Torah. Then the Rebbe is going to ask questions about them. Any questions from the crowd before we go on?
I mean, not a question, but so what he's saying is they had a different avoidance physically. We see it in what they carried, and in the way they carried. And they also had a different avoidance spiritually.
Correct.
I mean,
the like always, the physical expresses the spiritual. So what they did in the physical realm and what they were responsible for in the physical realm indicated what their avodah was, and because of that, only by Bnei Kos and Bnei Gershon it says Nasa Yisroel. And so we see there's three different levels. Bnei Kos was the main Nasa Yisroel. Bnei Gershon was only Gam Hey, also them. They also have the level of Nasa Yisroel, though not on the level of Kos. That's why it's only Gam. And Bnei Merari, since they were Oimdim, so it's not even applicable by them Nasa Yisroel at all. Not even in a way of also ran Gam Hey. You don't even say the idea of Nasa Yisroel at all. Okay, Memvav is based, line 19. We need to understand how do you do it. It's known to call it Yinisias Bnei Yisrael, Mishkan V'Kela B'Midbar. It's known that the entire idea of traveling of the Yidden with the Mishkan and its vessels in the wilderness, beginning with them, they're leaving Mitzrayim until they arrive to the Yarden, where they crossed into Eretz Yisrael. At that time, they entered into the good and comfortable land. What was the purpose of this traveling? Was to affect and to cause by the Yidden the idea of travel. In other words, there again, the physical expresses and mimics the spiritual. So the fact that they spent all this time traveling was to evoke and express by them and to bring out by the Yidden the level of traveling. So therefore, the Rebbe asks, how can we say that there were some that weren't travelers? How is it possible to say by the family of Merari there was not the avodah in the way of travel? This means though the avodah of the family of Merari was carrying the beams of the Mishkan on their own. In other words, just left to themselves. Don't bring Bnei Merari into the equation. The Atzi Shittim on their own, they're Oimdim. They're standing. Mikol Makim, but despite the fact that the Atzi Shittim on their own are standing, It should have been the idea of traveling without a boundary. Because all the parts of the Mishkan were traveling with the Yidden in the Midbar. And since the purpose, like we just now said, of the Yidden traveling in the Midbar with the components of the Mishkan was to affect by the Yidden the level of Hiluch, so even though the Kroshim, the Atzishitim on their own are Oimdim, but by them traveling with the assistance of the Bnei Merari, they should have been in a state of Hiluch. They should be in a way of traveling. They should be in a way of being unlimited. Because through the Mishkan was accomplished the idea that I will dwell amongst them in each and every one of them. So in other words, in every person that was involved in the Mishkan's process, which is the whole entire Klal Yisrael, it should have affected what the traveling of the Mishkan was meant to do, which is the idea of the idea of Bligvul, the traveling without a boundary. Including also the boards and the beams of the Mishkan. Not only that, the main existence and support of the Mishkan is the beams. If you would not have the beams, so then the curtains, the covers would not be able to be there, and obviously wouldn't have the kalim in it, and so on and so forth. You wouldn't have a place for the aron in it. So therefore, how could you dismiss it and say they're only standing? Therefore, we're forced to say he looked at also by the Bnei Merari was the general idea of traveling believable without a boundary, without a limitation, and therefore they were also entitled and connected to this idea of raise up their head. Since their service in the carrying of the boards of the Mishkan, of the beams of the Mishkan, was through wagons, the loike b'nei Gershom she'eslam hoisa gam avodas masa, not like the b'nei Gershom that they also had things that they had to carry personally, not via loading it on wagons. So therefore, I said, inegam inyan hahiluch kosher mechinas agolos sheroimes al nefshabam. So the Rebbe says like this, that their hiluch, their traveling was connected with the level of wagons, which wagons indicates the idea of the nefesh habahamis. In other words, you're using something else as a tool and a vehicle for the traveling. It's not in and of itself that there is that type of traveling. So that's what it means to say that when we're saying that the Bnei Gershon, there was no hiluch, there was no traveling, and by the Bnei Gershon, it was a level of nosoyas. By the Bnei Merari, it wasn't a level of hiluch, it wasn't a way of traveling, and by the Bnei Merari, it wasn't a level of Nasayas Rosh. It doesn't mean that it wasn't there at all, but rather, just like physically it was carried through the wagons, symbolically the wagons indicate something else that carries the person, the Nefesh HaBahamis. And through the Nefesh HaBahamis, and in the Nefesh HaBahamis, that's where you had the level of Halicha B'Ligvul. So the Rebbe is going to explain this in Oizgim. Any questions before we go on?
Is there any relation between Hagulus, the wagon, the word for wagon, and gullus?
No, there isn't. Not that I've ever heard of, because they're totally different root. I'm actually curious, now that you brought that up, if there's a relationship between the word agolus and egel, which means a cat, indicating an animal. So if anybody has an idea about that, maybe Dr. Ravnoy, if you have any thoughts about that, if you've ever heard any relationship between the two, perhaps. Okay, let's go on to Eis Gimel, line 12. Yuvan Bahagdim Bir in Avoida the Hilch Blig Volt be understood by first prefacing the explanation of the Avoida of traveling without a boundary. That occurs specifically through the descent down here below. There are three components in this. One component and one idea that occurs through a descent down here below. The very travel without a boundary that occurs through the descent down here below. What does that mean? So he says, where do we have the traveling without any boundaries? This is the love for Hashem. When the animal soul, not just the godly soul, but the Nefesh HaBahamis also attains the love of Hashem after it's refined. So then we reach a level of hiluch, of traveling without a boundary. Since the root of the animal soul is from the world of Tayu, is higher than the root of the godly soul. Therefore, specifically in the Nefesh HaBahamis, it applies to it the term that's brought down in the pasuk. It says there are many harvests or much produce in the power of an ox, which is strange. Isn't a person higher than an ox? But even though he's higher than an ox, if a person were to plow and plant the field and harvest the field, so then he would be very limited how much they would be able to plant and harvest. What would be the result? How much produce there would be. But when a person uses an ox to be able to plow and to do all the other heavy lifting type of work in the field, so then a person would reach great and much more produce. Same thing Chassidus always brings down, that even though the Nefesh HaLekis is higher than the Nefesh HaBahamis, Nefesh HaLekis is likened to an Adam, Nefesh HaBahamis is likened to the Behema. Still in all, only through the transformation of the Nefesh HaBahamis, because its root is from the world of Tayu, which is higher than Nefesh HaLekis. Therefore, you can reach Inyan Ha'ava Bli Gvul. You can reach this love without a boundary, which the Nefesh HaLekis on its own. When it has a love for Hashem, its love is in no limited fashion. That is one way how we reach an avodah of Bli Gvul without a limitation, without boundaries, by the descent of the neshama down here below. The Inyan Hasheni, a second thing that occurs when the neshama descends down here below, that brings about this traveling without a boundary. What's the purpose of traveling without a boundary? So there should be the idea that we will run after you. Many of the Shvuos V'Amarim and the Sfiras V'Amarim bring down what it says, Mashcheni acharecha merutza, Haviani hamelech hador. That was saying, Mashcheni, draw me. When did Hashem draw us out? That was when He took us out of Mitzrayim. Then it says, Acharecha narutza, we will run after you, because what related to Hashem when we left Mitzrayim? Only the Nefesh HaLekis. So Pesach is primarily about the godly soul. It's not about the Nefesh HaBahamis. The Nefesh HaBahamis was comfortable and liked Mitzrayim and so on. During the time of Sfiras Omer, we need to bring the Nefesh HaBahamis on board. Therefore, we say, Acharecha narutza, we will run after you, but it says we, narutza, not arutza, I will run. And it's in a way of a passion and an excitement. That's why it's called running. But the main point is it's plural. And then it says afterwards, Haviyani Amel Chadarav, concerning Shavuos. It's not important for the point here. But often the Mamarim explain, Mashcheni is about me, the Nefesh HaLekis, singular, and then Acharecha Narutza, it's both Nefesh HaLekis and the Nefesh HaBahamis. But here, the plural of Narutza the Rebbe is going to emphasize is Shagam HaNefesh HaLekis, Shebchinas HaTikun Tia Betnud Shel Bli Gvul. Also, the godly soul that is normally Tikkun is the level of the world of Atzilus. Tikkun, everything is established and set and normal. So over there, the nefesh elokis is in a way that is limited. It's not in a state of running. Running is something that results from the passion of nefesh habahamis, which is infectious, and because it's so infectious, it therefore it affects that nefesh elokis should also run towards the Eibishter. So the chiddush of acharechem narutza in the plural is not just that we get the nefesh habahamis on board, but we get the nefesh elokis that normally doesn't run, that nefesh elokis should also run. So it's a plural of running that also nefesh elokis should run. So that is the chiddush of the Yerida of the Neshama Lamata, that nefesh elokis, which is ordinarily very staid and very relaxed and approaches everything very calmly, is going to go in a way of beyond limitations, thanks to the excitement of the nefesh habahamis. We'll stop over here.